really the focus this morning is to talk about 360 wide drop side dress. Many of you are very familiar with this, have growers running them. You've got them possibly on your own bars, and you've seen the benefit of them. And so we've been getting a lot of questions over the last several months about, what are we seeing for response? Why are we seeing that response? How short a corn can we go in? Is there damaging issues with the corn if we go in too early? Where do you guys really want us to be in at as we try to overlap those residuals of nitrogen, or the handoff of one application to another application, or a handoff from a mineralization type situation of what the soil is giving, and then we supplement it with our application as growers, farmers in there. So that's really what we're going to talk about here today. When we apply nitrogen, what we've learned is there's really multiple things that can happen with that nitrogen that we apply. Obviously sulfur, I would be doing an injustice if I don't talk sulfur when we talk about wide drop and nitrogen, because sulfur is something that is something that we desperately need on most acres. It's an efficiency driver with nitrogen, with potassium, with other parts of what we do from a plant nutrition standpoint. But when we look at where it goes, number one, that nitrogen can go into the corn plant. Obviously, that's for the most part. Most people would say, well, that's exactly what I want it to do. Another part of it can be, we have a microbial environment underneath the ground that desires protein. It desires carbohydrates, it desires protein, very similar to the human body. And nitrogen is a protein source. And so if they're slightly lacking a protein from what they're getting from what they're doing under the ground through residue and organic matter, there's a possibility that we can boost up their activity. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because that stimulation can then stimulate them to actually be more active and actually release more nitrogen. And so those are two things that are positive. Obviously, the next thing is when we apply nitrogen, we can not use it efficiently, and we can't, we're not really doing much of anything to enhance that in the plant to produce yield, or we can potentially lose it. And so really the goal that we have and the why of what we're doing with this split nitrogen and looking at different options of wide drop on sprayers or wide drop on side dress bars or things like that is, obviously we want to get as much of that working for you than necessarily not. So this is basically the soil that your roots live in. And so when we talk about stimulation, this population down here needs to be fed very similarly to what we need to be fed as a human being. And there's a carbohydrate part of it, there's a protein part of it, there's a balance in that, there's a release of excessive carbs that they don't need, there's a release of excessive protein or nitrogen that they don't need. That is really what we look at as mineralization. So certainly when we talk about farmer applied nitrogen doing work in the soil, it certainly is not a bad thing. It really comes back and rewards, boosts this population at different times, and really allows it to release more nitrogen, which can drive our nitrogen efficiency. So the question is, when we start looking at side dress, why would someone look at and how important is placement at this time frame? So when we started the journey with wide drop back in 2014, we spent a lot of time on sprayers. Certainly didn't need to be a high clearance sprayer, but we saw a machine there that already had a tank. In a lot of cases on farms had capabilities to be able to be over more acres to justify those things, and we did that. And so what we saw when we looked at side dress is a lot of growers were coming to us and saying, okay, if placement is important with that, why can't it be in placement with wide drop side dress? And Matt Foes, one of our regional agronomy managers, was certainly a key person in saying, you know what, I think this is an area that we need to look into, and 360 did. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about what that placement does at that time, and just a simple switch of a coulter to a wide drop. So what have we been seeing just strictly in a yield difference? So that's basically taking the wide drop off and, taking the coulter off, putting the wide drop on, and strictly looking at a placement. So we're running the same rate, we're doing it at the same time. And so are we getting more nitrogen into the corn plant, and are we seeing that in a yield? So Bex has done 2 years worth of data, 16, 17. They have been a good partner for us on their PFR studies. They're going to continue to be testing more of our technology, and they're going to continue to be looking at this just year in, year out. So what they've seen over 2 years is about 5.8 bushel. We've seen a lot of different growers run this. We've seen 360 run this, and we've certainly seen the advantages of what we've seen as well with working alongside of U.S. dealers and certainly as growers to see what this difference might be. So really our 3-year advantage with Greg and really across the trials that have been turned into 360 is about a 6 bushel advantage. So it's always interesting to spend time with growers and with dealers that have growers, or in fact they may farm themselves, and just seeing their response back to what they're seeing with wide drop side dress. So Randy Aberle, which many of you may know, he was one that ran part bar with wide drop side dress and part with coulter, and wanted to see the difference. And after doing that for a period of time, he quickly switched over and pulled the trigger and said, you know what, this is crazy. Let's just run this whole system this way. And so he's seeing about 8 bushel in all the trials that he's ran. Just looking at placement, a lot of people that have done this have just said, boy, I just really see the advantage and the reduction of risk of the ability of trying to get what I'm paying for and applying into the corn plant. So what you'll see here is just some data here that our team put together this year as Greg continues to run these trials through this year. And what we saw this year, strictly on placement, with all other factors being the same, is about 6.6 bushel. And here in just a little bit, we're going to focus on the economics of what drives that and what does 6.6 bushel mean across different sizes of bars, across different acres over a year. And so economics obviously drive our decisions and our return on investment. So we're gonna take that to the next level here in just a minute. But the one thing that we have learned, and the why behind a lot of things, is that I learned a long time ago, what I thought I knew was big roots meant more stability, more nutrient uptake, and higher yields. And I've got a slide here from Fred Below on the right there that you'll see. And it was interesting sitting in one of Fred's meetings, and his comment I'll never forget is, roots don't have to be big, they just need to be effective. And so a lot of our hybrids today, as we continue to push populations, the genetics, the way that they're driven to create yield, doesn't necessarily make the footprint of those hybrids that I used to sell in the late 90s, that were even before we really had much for traits. At that point, we were planting 27, 28,000. We allowed things to flex more. We allowed root systems to have more breathing room. Today, things are tighter because ear count drives yield. And so root systems are smaller. And so as we're really looking at this, how can we better, with placement, try to get those nutrients into the corn plant? So what have we found? It's really easy to do research on fields, and there's so much variability in fields that we really need to look at these things from large trials. And so the one question that we always had is, well, what does that mean? And so the next slide here is we found Dr. Mulvaney with the University of Illinois, and this is probably the most intriguing, industry-leading thing that I've ever seen, because we can do research and we can see things go back and forth and we can like the results, but there's still another chapter to that book. And so obviously you're seeing very tall corn here. These are just pictures that we put in the background, but what Dr. Mulvaney did on these trials is he basically said, if I'm going to apply nitrogen, and based on where I put it, what is the likelihood that it's going to get into the corn plant? And so what we're seeing is about a 25% advantage of placing it at the base of the plant versus putting it in the center of the row. So we're seeing a yield response, we're seeing a scientific response, and the question is why we now have these two components. So let's continue to look a little bit deeper. So why do we think this is happening? Well, I think, just from the conversation, you guys probably understand a little bit of why this is happening. So what I've really felt, and I think what 360 has really started to feel, is that if you farm 43,560 square feet in an acre, each square foot is not farmed the same. They don't have the same amount of root mass. We plant corn in rows, so we can manage it in rows. Obviously, 30-inch rows is very popular. Still a lot of 38-inch rows to the south. And, just the movement to even smaller row spacing here with 20 to 15 that people are working with. So the next question is, we've got those 2 points of data. We've got yield, and we've got scientific information from Dr. Mulvaney. So the next question is, where is this nitrogen if it's not getting in the corn plant? And to what degree is it not being efficient? So this is a slide that probably many of you have already seen from me, but it resonates with me very well. So this field here had 100 pounds of fall anhydrous on it. It had 40 pounds of weed and feed, and it had 80 pounds of nitrogen UAN through a coulter bar. And so I went out about 3 weeks. So this was an early coulter pass. I went out about 3 weeks. We had roughly an inch of rain in that time frame. Between the time we applied to the time that I pulled, certainly corn was up much more. And so you can see the flag there in the center, and you can see the bags there. But what I did is I came in and I laid down a board across there. And so you'll see hole number 1 is in the corn row. You'll see hole number 9 is in the corn row, and you'll see the distribution of 0 to 12 and 12 to 24. And you'll see that even roughly 3 to 4 weeks after application, we are still seeing a tremendous amount of that nitrogen being in the 0 to 12 and the 12 to 24. And so the question is does nitrogen move side to side? Where do our roots move? Our roots move with water. And we're seeing that nitrogen application that was meant to hand off from something else, or a lot of times from a chemistry stand back, we talk about overlapping residuals. And so really in my mindset, what we do with weed control to make sure we don't germinate and have to manage something that has emerged, nitrogen is very much that same way. And so this is just one example that you can certainly do. I can nearly guarantee you that if you do this, you will see the exact same results that I've done. I've done this many, many, many times, and I come back to the same conclusion every time, that is what is happening with that application. So the next question is as we look later in the season, and I know we're talking about wide drop side dress, but let's say you're out wide drop side dressing or wide dropping in general at need a waste haul corn. And so at this point, we're starting to get a lot of canopy and a lot of funneling effect. And we'll hit on that just real briefly here in just a second. But this is a field that you can see the coulter went down the center at V9, and you can see the pollen. You can see some of the firing, certainly some potassium issues there, certainly some nitrogen issues there. This is bean stubble, first year corn. And the question is we've applied plenty of nitrogen, and we're going to look at that here on this next slide, is we applied 140 pounds of fall nitrogen followed by 70 pounds of nitrogen at V9 with a coulter. And so we're sitting back here. If we look at this picture, I pulled the ear back, the silks fell off, we had pollinated, but where is that nitrogen? And so when we look at the scale here, you'll see where the corn plant is, and you'll see there's a significant amount of a spike in the center of the row where we applied that nitrogen. And so the real question is when we start looking at wide drop side dress or wide drop in general, if we can push that down at the corn plant, we don't have that big mountain in the center of the row, and we're able to more efficiently use that. And I think long term, we will become more comfortable as we look at all the aspects of a field, from other fertility situations to soil type, that I think we continue to start looking at the ability to bring down these nitrogen rates slightly. Certainly, we don't want to make drastic measures because we don't want to run things out and we want to learn more. But so right now we've seen the yield response, we've seen the scientific that Dr. Mulvaney did, and now we've done measuring to start to understand where that nitrogen is. So the one thing that we talk a lot about, and we've invested a lot of time, is just understanding what that corn plant wants to do as we continue to move through that. So stem water is a big piece of that. So we think about stem water late mid-season, late season, as the plant really canopies. We have basically dark soils. But what I really looked at here in 2017 is that how soon do we start getting that effect? At what point do we start robbing water from a rain event that would land in the middle of the row, and we actually start funneling it to the base? And I would tell you that it starts earlier than what we think. Even at knee tall corn, we get a rain event, a light rain event, and it hits those leaves and it just funnels itself to the base. Now, here in the next slide, you're going to see taller corn, and you're going to say, well, maybe this isn't as relevant to a side dress application. But I would tell you that it's more relevant, I think, than we think, because if we apply that at knee tall or even slightly shorter, our corn grows pretty rapidly. And that thing can start getting up, and it can start routing that water a different direction, which I think is what we're seeing why we have so much in the center of the row. Number one, the plant's not using it. And number two, as we get up, we're getting less water there. So you'll see here about an eight time different here once the corn gets to be head tall. But as we start going through that, it's all of a sudden 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, all the way up to 8 times, and maybe even greater of what that corn plant is saying. I need a ton of water, and I'm going to be very selfish, and I need it at my base. I don't need it in the center of the row. So I think that's another part of that driver, that we're seeing that compounding effect even early on once we start getting leaves reaching out in the center of that row. So just something to keep in mind as you're starting to look at that. And you can see here in the picture just the lay of. You can see here just that this is the center of the row. This is later on. You can see the curve here of really where that moisture is. Now, that curve may not be as pronounced when we're side dressing with 360 side dress, but certainly still there is a factor there. So let's look here just a little bit at some of the economics when it comes to 360 wide drop side dress and return on investment. This is a chart that we just built. We've showed these comparisons to some degree at different meetings, but I built a calculator here, and we'll be sharing that with you here in the near future and add that to our website. Is what is the real impact of making such a simple change from a coulter to a wide drop side dress? And this is strictly a placement. This is strictly probably doing the same things you've always done from a rate standpoint to a timing standpoint for the most part, maybe not exactly, but probably for the most part, and then coming in and just saying that pass is paying me off better because I'm paying closer attention to detail. Very similar to a planter pass. That attention to detail on every pass we make, from a combine to a planter to a side dress to a tillage, can make significant impacts. So if we look at just year number one, and obviously these wide drop side dresses are going to last many, many, many years. If we take a 12 row bar that you're going to see there, and a 12 row bar, and then we're going to do 900 acres, let's just say, and this is a moving chart, so you can change this. The cells there in gray are certainly editable. We are going to increase, if we do that on 900 acres, 5,400 bushel. So that 900 acre grower is going to basically pull off about 6 more semis. If you take that times the market price that we've chosen 360 here, we've impacted additional revenue of about $19,500. The cost to outfit that bar is just a little bit less than $5,000. So your net income after expenses here is about $15,000. So year number one, that's a 293% return on investment. You'll see 16 rows, 1,600 acres. You'll see a 412% return on investment. And with a 24 row, you're looking at 359. And it really depends on your acres. So this is a great way to look. Now, you got to remember that in year number 2, you're going to see the same gain. You may have a better corn market price. You may have a slightly less. Really, quite honestly, we're seeing a 6 bushel gain. If you put that down to 2 bushel, you're still going to see at these numbers, you're going to see a strong positive return on investment. So just something to keep in mind. We're going to make this available to you to really be able to look at and sit down and really understand how that affects the operation that you're looking at. So next slide here. Apologize, let me back up here just a second. Next slide here is just talking about efficiency. And so Matt Foes put this slide together for me. This is Matt running his tractor. Hopefully you can see that on the right. And you can see his speed right here. He's going 8.9 miles an hour. He's running about 1,760 RPMs in 13th gear. You can see the height of the corn there. And so Matt has been a strong proponent of understanding what the value is of running side dress operationally versus running coulter. And so you'll see here just less damage, no coulter to get in the row. Root balls and dirt are not thrown into the row. For years and years of side dressing, those are 2 things that I hated. You know, as we did different things, if we get off, the coulter gets close, we prune roots, and we're doing things that is not synergistically bringing us more yield. The maintenance thing, I think, is huge. Many growers come to us and say, boy, what a change from replacing bearings. I power wash off, I run water through it, and I'm ready to store it. No ground engaging wear items. One of the biggest things there is if you're going out in different conditions with a coulter, you can open a slot that's not going to close. We can go out earlier. Our window of application, I think, is even stronger, and I believe it is stronger than just coulters because we have some flexibility with ground conditions versus a coulter that we really need things to dry out, so we're not creating sidewall compaction in that slot or even creating a slot that's not going to close. A few other points here that Matt has is just less horsepower, lower fuel use, higher speeds. And we'll talk about speed here in just a second. And so those are just some, not only did we just see the return on investment, now we're just seeing some of the operational efficiency and just as far as just growers being able to take a piece of equipment and just requiring less maintenance. So let's jump. So we kind of went through the whys, we went through the return on investments, we went through the yield, the scientific, the water, and everything that goes through that. So now a grower's made a decision. A grower and a dealer have worked together and made that decision and said, I want to buy 360 wide drop side dress. And for us, we want to be very disciplined in looking at what that means. So we put together wide drop best practices. Many of you have seen those. And so typically when we're using wide drop side dress, we may be in shorter corn than what we would be if we were running a poster machine. So crop safety is a big thing. So we've put together best practices of and we've also put together a very nice system as far as being able to look at safety and adjustability within the base. So a few things I want to point out here with this is small corn, just the field tip, small corn hoses should run 1 to 2 inches away from the base of the plant. You can move the 360 wide drop base into a narrow setting. Excuse me. You'll see right here that there's settings here, and we can really run that from 15 inch all the way to 38 inch corn. A lot of times when we're running on 30 inch corn, we may slide these into the 20 inch setting. We have some adjustability as this corn that you'll see here on the bottom left. We would want certainly at that point to be back in the 30 inch setting. just to continue to be able to, at that point, have pressure, slight pressure against the stock, just to continue to push for the best placement. Another thing that you can do is right here, there's a hose clamp, and that hose clamp can be loosened, and you can slightly twist that hose so that that hose is riding, and so it's applying that nitrogen not up against the base, but maybe 1 to 2 inches off. And so those are all things that you can do when we're in smaller corn. You'll see at this next point, as we look at the next arrow up with the next yellow dot that I just dropped, you have the ability, there's 3 different holes here that you can adjust the height of that. We also have a breakaway here if you would hit something. And another thing that you may or may not know is that we actually have a pin that can go across here that if you don't want it to break away. For instance, if you're folding up and you have issues with them wanting to break away and fall, there's actually a pin here that you can put in to continue to make that rigid. So if we move here to the bottom left, 2 other key things is these gauge wheels that you're going to see are really nice. You can set those, you can set your height, you can see your height right here. When you're in smaller corn, we want to run those about 10 inches off the ground, and those gauge wheels are going to keep us right where we want it to be. And the reason for that, and the most common hose length that we run is 30-inch hoses that you can see coming out here. And the reason that we do that is we allow that to sink down in there, and we get below some of those leaves that are not sloughed off yet. And it just continues to work to our benefit of trying to understand exactly how we can have the best placement that we can possibly have. And so I want you to visualize some things that we can do to just add to placement success and the things that we want to do. We'll have a lot of questions about, do we splash up? Are we burning the plant? How well do those hoses stay up against the row in small corn? And just different things like that. So you're looking at the coulter go down the center. You can start to feel the inefficiency of that placement based on everything that we've talked about. When you see the 2 boxes that I have there, you can see that our row cleaners, when we made that planter pass, have basically made a highway for us. And so we can lay that hose right up in there. We can adjust it the way that we want to adjust it. And we're able to bring that hose right down through there. So a lot of people say, boy, I don't know if I can maintain the speed that I did with the coulter. And in some cases, you may not be able to. In some cases, I think you'll exceed it. It's really going to depend on how much of a highway that you have there to do that. Now, when we keep those bases about 10 inches off the ground, that hose is not going to ping. It's going to roll over anything that may have blown back in its path and really keep that hose where it's at. So this is a picture here from Matt Foes, and you can just see the corn height that he's going through, the placement that he's working at. And I realize that you may say, boy, there's just not, if we get a rain event, how much of this are we going to funnel? But you'll be surprised, even the 2x to maybe 3x that we're getting at the base, even at that tall of corn, to help drive moisture into that base. So the reason that I have this picture up is I know it's got an undercover on there, but the one thing that I want to say when we look at maybe going in a little bit smaller corn with wide drop side dress, and just the peace of mind that you can know when you're running this is we can sink that wide drop base lower when we're running those wheels, and about 10 inches is about where we want to be. Just so you can see the leaves, we want to try our best to try to get underneath those leaves as we can. You can kind of see the highway that Matt has, that hose is able to run into, and just a great experience as far as just being able to feed that plant at the base. So another important question that we get quite a bit is, can we lay nitrogen on top of the ground? And I may or may not be the right guy to ask. I've been using stabilizers from my retail days for years, and I've tested them and I've proven my curiosity out that they really work. The question is do you need them to work? I guess that's not the question. The question is, do you need them? If you apply them and you use products that do the job, there's certainly stabilizers out there that I think are less effective. Agrotane is the one I'm using in this example today. And a lot of people ask, well, what do I need? And so really what we're looking at is a urease inhibitor. So about 50% of the UAN that you apply is going to be in a stage where it could become volatile if it's not pushed in with water. And so agrotane is a urease inhibitor that protects you for, in the Midwest, probably about 18 to 20 days with the weather that we have. If you get further south with more sun, more heat, that might be more of a 14 to 18 days. Makes a little bit of a difference. But you'll see here with UAN at 225, which is 35 cents a pound, it takes about 6 cents per pound of nitrogen to stabilize it for 18 to 21 days. And so some of you may see that as being important. If a rain event is coming in, you may not see that. If you're in a spell where things are dry, it's certainly important, and that you have an option to protect that nitrogen investment. So if you're coming out with about 60 pounds, it's going to cost you just less than 1 bushel to protect that 60 pounds for about 18 to 21 days. So as you make these recommendations, as you utilize this on your farm, it's just important to know what you want. If you're looking at another type of a stabilizer that might be both a urease inhibitor and also slows it from the ammonium turning into nitrate, these prices are going to be about double per pound. And that's not really what you need. In my opinion, you're more looking at just the urease part of it, and there are options out there if you get into these situations. The one thing is, even when we were running coulters, we did use agrotane in a lot of cases, because in certain situations in certain parts of the field that were wetter, we weren't able to get that slot closed as we were trying to get that on. And so we ran agrotane as well, just to make sure that we were protecting that. So I don't think it's necessarily a thing that says, boy, if you're using Y-drop, you need to use it. Any other application, you don't. I think it's more of a risk assessment of what you think, and it gives you an option to be able to do that if you want to. So as we look at this, this is just right out of the price and retail guide. Very simple ordering. You order a U-bolt based on what the frame dimensions of the bar that you're mounting on. You also get the base unit with everything. The orifices would have to be ordered in addition to this, and for roughly about $450, you take a coulter off and you're able to put Y-drop on. So just a few other things here. The rebate continues on the purchase of 11 Y-drop side dress units or larger. There's a $500 rebate that you can take advantage of to be able to do that. So with that, I want to thank you very much for being a part of this, and hope the information was valuable.